Here in the hollow of Wise County, the courthouse behind me once held a trial that changed this town forever. In 1892, the youngest of the Russell brothers was convicted and hanged for a murder at a mine he did not commit.
Mountain Phantom. The Russell brothers hunted. 21 marshals who hanged their brother in public square. The deadliest vendetta against law enforcement in American history, and the longest manhunt the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Russell brothers. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of McDowell County, West Virginia, known simply as the Backcountry. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Appalachian Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the Tug Fork River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones, and the roads were few and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most lawless and dangerous sections in all of America. From the early period, when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This, no doubt, has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were mountaineers who lived a simple existence. Most of them lived in log cabins, surviving by farming and hunting and trapping. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. The people of these hills had developed their own way of living, their own code of honor, and their own understanding of what justice meant. You see, family was everything in these mountains. Blood ties meant more than any law written in some distant capital, more than any badge worn by any lawman, more than life itself for many of these fierce and independent people. When a wrong was done to one member of a family, it was done to all of them. And the response was expected to be swift and terrible. Feuds between families could last for generations, with killings answered by killings in an endless cycle of vengeance that the outside world could barely comprehend. This was the world into which the Russell brothers were born, and this was the code by which they would live and die. The Russell family had lived in McDowell County since before anyone could remember, their ancestors among the first white settlers to push into this wilderness after the Revolutionary War. They had carved out a homestead in a hollow so remote that even other mountain people considered it isolated, a place where the sun only touched the valley floor for a few hours each day, and where strangers were regarded with suspicion bordering on hostility. The family had prospered in their own way, not by the standards of the outside world, but by the measures that mattered in the mountains. They had land and livestock, a sturdy cabin, and most importantly, they had each other. The hollow where the Russells made their home had no official name on any map, but local people called it Russell's Gap, a recognition of how completely the family had claimed this territory as their own. The approach was treacherous, a narrow trail that wound along cliff faces and crossed the same creek 7 times before reaching the small valley where the cabin stood. This natural fortress had protected the family for generations, making them virtually immune to the incursions of law enforcement or hostile neighbors that plagued other mountain families. Anyone approaching could be spotted from miles away, and the terrain made ambush nearly impossible. The cabin itself was a substantial structure by mountain standards, built from logs that Ezekiel Russell and his father had cut from the surrounding forest over the course of 3 summers. It had 2 stories and 4 rooms, a luxury that spoke to the family's relative prosperity. Behind the cabin stood a barn for the livestock, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and a small building that housed the still, where the family produced the whiskey that supplemented their income. Everything about the homestead spoke of permanence, of a family that intended to remain on this land for generations to come. There were 7 Russell brothers in all, sons of Ezekiel Russell and his wife Martha, born over a span of 20 years in that remote hollow. The oldest was Elijah, born in 1865, a giant of a man who stood well over 6 feet tall and was known throughout the county for his strength and his temper. Then came Jacob in 1867, quieter than his older brother but no less formidable, a man who thought before he acted and who rarely made mistakes. Isaac was born in 1870, the most sociable of the brothers, the one who could charm strangers and negotiate disputes, though he was just as deadly as the others when circumstances required. Samuel came in 1873, then Daniel in 1876, then Joseph in 1880, and finally Benjamin in 1885, the baby of the family, beloved by all his older brothers and protected with a ferocity that would ultimately lead to tragedy. That's right, Benjamin Russell was different from his brothers in ways that everyone noticed but no one discussed openly. He was smaller than the others, gentler in his manner, more interested in books and learning than in hunting and fighting. He had been sickly as a child and had nearly died twice before his 10th birthday, experiences that had left him with a contemplative nature that set him apart from the rough and ready men around him. His brothers adored him, saw in him something precious that needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of mountain life. They had no way of knowing that their love for Benjamin would eventually destroy them all. The trouble began in the spring of 1902, when Benjamin Russell was 17 years old and starting to venture out into the world beyond the family hollow. He had developed an interest in the coal mining operations that were beginning to transform the region, fascinated by the machinery and the engineering that allowed men to pull black rock from deep within the earth. He started making trips to the company town of Keystone, watching the miners work, asking questions that annoyed the foreman, but that they tolerated because he was clearly harmless. It was on one of these trips that Benjamin met a girl named Sarah Pennington, the daughter of a mine supervisor, and everything changed. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand what the coal companies were doing to these mountains and their people. That's right. By 1902, the great coal barons had descended on southern West Virginia like locusts, buying up mineral rights from families who didn't understand what they were selling, building company towns where workers were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores, and establishing a system of control that amounted to industrial feudalism. The old mountain families who had lived here for generations suddenly found themselves strangers in their own land, their way of life threatened by forces they barely understood. The Pennington family represented everything that the mountain people had learned to hate about the new order. William Pennington had come from Philadelphia with nothing but ambition and connections, and within 5 years he had become one of the most powerful men in McDowell County. He owned 3 mines, controlled the local government through a network of bribes and favors, and treated the native population with a contempt that he barely bothered to disguise. His daughter Sarah had been raised to share her father's prejudices, but something about Benjamin Russell touched a part of her that her upbringing had not managed to corrupt. Sarah was unlike any girl Benjamin had ever encountered. She could read and write fluently, had been educated at a proper school in Charleston, and spoke of a world beyond the mountains that seemed almost magical to a boy who had never traveled more than 20 miles from where he was born. She was also beautiful, with dark hair and green eyes that haunted Benjamin's dreams, and she seemed to return his affection despite the obvious gulf between their social positions. They began meeting in secret, walking together along the river, talking about books and dreams and the future they might share. Benjamin believed he had found something worth more than all the land and livestock his family possessed. What Benjamin did not know was that Sarah was fighting her own battle against her father and the life he had planned for her. She had been betrothed since childhood to the son of another mining executive, a young man she found dull and pompous and incapable of the kind of genuine feeling that Benjamin showed her every time they met. She saw in this mountain boy something authentic that was missing from everyone else in her world, a connection to the land and to family that the industrial class had lost in their pursuit of wealth. She was falling in love with him just as certainly as he was falling in love with her, though she knew that her father would never permit the relationship to continue. Their secret meetings continued through the spring and into the early summer, each one deepening the bond between them. They would sit for hours beside the river talking about everything and nothing, making plans for a future that both of them knew was probably impossible. Benjamin spoke of taking Sarah away to some distant place where no one knew either of their families, where they could start fresh without the weight of history and expectation pressing down upon them. Sarah spoke of convincing her father to accept Benjamin, of somehow bridging the gap between their worlds through the force of love alone. Both knew these were dreams, but dreams were all they had. But Sarah's father had other ideas. That's right. William Pennington was a man of ambition who had come to these mountains to make his fortune in the coal industry, and he had no intention of seeing his daughter married to some illiterate hillbilly from a notorious family of troublemakers. When he discovered the relationship, he forbade Sarah from seeing Benjamin again and threatened to have the young man arrested if he came anywhere near her. Benjamin, heartbroken but stubborn in the way of his family, continued to meet Sarah in secret. And that's when things got ugly, because William Pennington decided to make an example of the boy who had dared to reach above his station. The incident that would set everything in motion occurred on a warm evening in July 1902. Benjamin had arranged to meet Sarah near the old mill pond outside of Keystone, a spot they had used many times before without detection. But this time, William Pennington had learned of the meeting and had arranged a reception. When Benjamin arrived, he found not Sarah, but a group of company guards and 3 deputy marshals who had been deputized specifically for this purpose. They accused Benjamin of trespassing on company property, of attempted theft, and of assaulting a young woman of good family. None of these charges were true, but truth had little currency when powerful men wanted something done. Benjamin was arrested and taken to the county jail in Welch, where he was held without bail on charges that would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous. The jail was a stone building that had been constructed just 2 years earlier, built specifically to house the increasing number of people who ran afoul of the coal company's interests. Its cells were cold and damp, designed more for punishment than for mere detention, and the guards were company men who took pleasure in tormenting their prisoners. Benjamin was placed in solitary confinement from the moment of his arrival, denied visitors, denied communication with his family, denied even the basic dignity of knowing what would happen to him next. His brothers learned of the arrest the following morning when a neighbor who had witnessed the events rode through the night to reach Russell's Gap. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Elijah wanted to ride to Welch immediately and break Benjamin out of jail by force, regardless of the consequences. Jacob counseled patience, arguing that they should first try legal means to secure their brother's release. Isaac suggested using his contacts in town to gather information about what they were really facing. The debate raged through the morning, but eventually Jacob's cooler head prevailed. They would ride to town as a family, present themselves to the authorities, and demand their brother's release through proper channels. His brothers learned of the arrest the following morning and immediately rode to town to demand his release. Elijah, as the oldest, spoke for the family, his voice steady despite the rage that burned in his eyes. He offered to pay any bail that might be set, offered to guarantee his brother's appearance at trial, offered anything they wanted, if they would just let Benjamin come home. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Whitfield, who was deeply in debt to the coal companies, refused all offers and told the Russell brothers to leave before he arrested them too. What happened next would be debated for years in the newspapers and courtrooms of West Virginia. The official account claimed that Elijah Russell attacked the sheriff, necessitating the use of force to subdue him. The Russell family version, supported by several witnesses who would later be intimidated into silence, was very different. According to them, Elijah had turned to leave as ordered when a deputy struck him from behind with a rifle butt. In the confusion that followed, shots were fired, and by the time the smoke cleared, Deputy Marshal Henry Collins lay dead on the jailhouse steps. Elijah Russell had a bullet wound in his shoulder, and the remaining brothers had fled into the hills with warrants for their arrest. Now the coal companies saw an opportunity in this tragedy. That's right. They had been looking for a way to break the power of the old mountain families, who still controlled much of the land and resources in the region, families who refused to sell their mineral rights and who encouraged their workers to resist company demands. The Russells were not the wealthiest or most influential of these families, but they were certainly the most dangerous, and making an example of them would send a message to everyone else. William Pennington took the lead in organizing the response, using his connections in the state capital to ensure that the full weight of the law would come down on the Russell family. Benjamin Russell never had a chance. His trial was a mockery of justice from beginning to end, presided over by a judge who had received substantial campaign contributions from the coal companies and prosecuted by an attorney who would later become a company executive. The charges had multiplied in the weeks since his arrest, now including conspiracy to commit murder, based on the theory that Benjamin had lured his brothers to town specifically to attack the deputies. No evidence supported this theory, but no evidence was required. The jury, composed entirely of company employees and their relatives, deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in the public square of Welch on the first day of September 1902. This was unusual even for that time and place, as most executions were conducted within prison walls away from public view. But William Pennington had insisted on a public spectacle, wanting the entire region to witness what happened to those who defied the new order. The governor, who owed his election to coal company money, approved the request without comment. Benjamin Russell, 17 years old and guilty of nothing more than falling in love with the wrong girl, would die in front of a crowd assembled specifically to watch him suffer. The Russell brothers learned of the sentence from sympathetic sources and immediately began planning a rescue. For 3 weeks they gathered weapons, recruited supporters from other mountain families who had their own grievances against the companies, and developed a plan to intercept the transport taking Benjamin from jail to the gallows. They had 40 men ready to fight, enough to overwhelm the guards and spirit Benjamin away to safety in the deep wilderness where no posse could follow. It was a desperate plan. But desperate times demanded desperate measures, and the brothers would not let their youngest sibling die without a fight. But someone betrayed them. The night before the planned rescue, a massive force of deputy marshals and company guards descended on the hollow where the brothers had gathered their men, and in the chaos of the firefight that followed, most of their supporters were killed or captured. The brothers themselves escaped only because they knew the terrain better than anyone alive, but their force was shattered, their plan ruined, and their brother's execution would proceed as scheduled. They could only watch from a distant ridge as the sun rose on September 1st, knowing that somewhere in the town below, Benjamin was walking to his death. The hanging of Benjamin Russell became one of the most infamous spectacles in West Virginia history. Over 3,000 people crowded into the public square of Welch that morning, some genuinely curious, others there because their employers had ordered them to attend, and a few who came hoping that something would go wrong and the condemned man would be saved at the last moment. The square had been transformed for the occasion, with a newly constructed gallows standing at its center and viewing platforms erected for the wealthy and powerful who wanted the best view of the proceedings. Vendors sold food and drink at the edges of the crowd, treating the execution as if it were a carnival or a fair. Benjamin was led from the jail at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, his hands bound behind his back and his ankles shackled so that he could only take small shuffling steps. He had been given a bath and dressed in a clean white shirt that would show the blood if anything went wrong. A deliberate choice by the authorities, who wanted to maximize the visual impact of his death. Despite his circumstances, Benjamin walked with his head held high, refusing to show fear to the crowd that had gathered to watch him die. Some who were present would later say that there was something almost transcendent about his demeanor, a peace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. The gallows itself was a simple structure, just a platform with a crossbeam and the trapdoor that would open beneath the condemned man's feet. Benjamin climbed the 13 steps to the platform without assistance, pausing at the top to look out over the crowd one last time. His eyes scanned the faces, perhaps searching for someone he knew, perhaps simply taking in the world one last time. Then a white hood was placed over his head and a noose was tightened around his neck. He said nothing as these preparations were made, though those closest to the platform said later that his lips were moving in what might have been a prayer. The trapdoor opened at 10:15, and Benjamin Russell dropped to his death in front of the assembled crowd. But the executioner, whether through incompetence or design, had miscalculated the length of the rope. Instead of dying instantly from a broken neck as was intended, Benjamin strangled slowly, his body twisting and jerking at the end of the rope for nearly 15 minutes, while the crowd watched in horrified fascination. Some people turned away, unable to bear the sight. Others stood transfixed, their faces pale with the realization that they were witnessing something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. And somewhere on a ridge overlooking the town, 6 brothers watched through field glasses as their youngest sibling was murdered by the state. They saw his body jerking at the end of the rope. They saw the crowd that had gathered to watch him die. They saw the company officials standing on a viewing platform, drinking champagne and congratulating each other on a job well done. And something broke inside each of them, something fundamental and irreparable, replaced by a cold and absolute determination that would consume the rest of their lives. Before Benjamin's body had even stopped moving, the Russell brothers had sworn an oath that would transform them from outlaws into legends. And that oath, spoken on a mountainside in the blood-red light of that September morning, would result in the deaths of 21 men and the longest manhunt in Appalachian history. You see, the Russell brothers didn't strike immediately. That's right. Despite their rage and grief, they understood that rash action would only get them killed before they could accomplish their purpose. They retreated deeper into the mountains, to places that only their family knew, and they began to plan. They made a list of every person who had played a role in Benjamin's death, from the deputies who had arrested him, to the judge who had sentenced him, to the marshals who had stood guard at his execution. 21 names were on that list, and the brothers swore that every one of them would die before they were done. The first killing came 3 months after Benjamin's execution, on a cold December night when Marshal Henry Patterson was walking home from a tavern in Welch. Patterson had been one of the guards at Benjamin's hanging, and he had been bragging in the tavern about how the boy had danced at the end of the rope. He never heard the shot that killed him, never saw the face of the man who fired it. His body was found the next morning with a note pinned to his chest that read simply, "Justice for Benjamin Russell, 1 of 21. The county exploded with fear and outrage. The authorities responded by forming the largest posse in the history of southern West Virginia. Over 200 men deputized to hunt down the Russell brothers and bring them to justice. They scoured the mountains for weeks, following every lead, interrogating everyone who might have information about the fugitives. The posse was divided into 10 teams, each assigned to search a different section of the vast wilderness that surrounded McDowell County. They had dogs trained to track human scent, experienced woodsmen who claimed to know the mountains as well as any native, and enough supplies to stay in the field for months if necessary. But the mountains proved to be an enemy that no amount of manpower could overcome. That's right. These hills had been sheltering fugitives since before the Revolution, and they kept their secrets well. The Russell brothers knew every cave, every ravine, every hidden spring in 100 square miles of wilderness. They knew which paths could be traversed quickly and which led to deadly dead ends. They knew where to find food and water, where to shelter from storms, where to disappear so completely that even someone standing 10 feet away would never see them. And they had the support of a population that viewed the posse as an invading army. Every family in those mountains had some grievance against the coal companies or the law enforcement that served them. Every family had lost someone to mine accidents or seen loved ones imprisoned for crimes that seemed trivial or fabricated. The Russell brothers were not just outlaws to these people, they were symbols of resistance, proof that the powerful could be made to pay for their crimes. Farmers who would never have broken the law themselves suddenly found reasons to misdirect search parties, to warn of approaching danger, to leave food and supplies in places where the brothers might find them. The posse found itself fighting not just 6 men, but an entire culture of resistance. But the mountains were vast, and the Russells knew them better than anyone. And by the time the posse gave up in exhaustion, the brothers had struck again. Deputy Marshal William Crawford was shot through his kitchen window while eating dinner with his family. Another note left at the scene: Justice for Benjamin Russell, 2 of 21. The pattern continued through the winter and into the spring of 1903. The brothers never struck twice in the same way, never established any pattern that the authorities could predict. Sometimes they used rifles from a distance, picking off their targets from positions that offered clear lines of sight and easy escape routes. Sometimes they got close enough to use knives, approaching their victims with a stealth that seemed almost supernatural, leaving bodies that were not discovered until hours or days after the killing. Once they set fire to a boarding house where 3 marshals were sleeping, picking off the men as they fled the flames. Each killing was marked with a note, each death added to the growing tally. The notes themselves became objects of morbid fascination for the newspapers that covered the vendetta. They were written in a careful hand, grammatically correct and strangely formal, containing not just the running count, but sometimes additional messages directed at the authorities or the families of the victims. One note read, "This man helped hang an innocent boy. Now he knows what Benjamin knew in his final moments." Another said simply, "Justice comes to those who think themselves above it." The newspapers published these notes word for word, and each publication brought new attention to the Russell brothers and their cause. The fear that gripped McDowell County during those months was unlike anything the region had ever experienced. Men who had once walked freely through the towns and mining camps now traveled in armed groups, looking over their shoulders at every sound. Women whose husbands were on the Russell brothers list stopped sleeping at night, starting at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows. Children were kept indoors, schools were closed, and churches held special prayer services for protection from the phantom killers who seemed to move through the mountains like ghosts. By April, 8 men were dead, and the entire law enforcement apparatus of southern West Virginia was paralyzed with fear. The terror spread beyond the immediate targets to encompass everyone connected to the coal companies. That's right, managers refused to walk alone after dark. Foremen demanded armed escorts to and from work. Company executives who had once moved freely through the region now traveled in armored carriages with heavily armed guards. The message was clear. Anyone who had participated in Benjamin Russell's death was a marked man, and the brothers would not stop until every name on their list had been crossed off. The coal companies, which had thought they were establishing order by making an example of Benjamin, had instead unleashed chaos. The spring of 1903 brought a new marshal to McDowell County, a man named James Blackwood, who had made his reputation hunting outlaws in the Oklahoma Territory. Blackwood was everything the Russell brothers' previous pursuers had not been: patient, methodical, and intimately familiar with the tactics of men who lived outside the law. He studied every killing in detail, interviewed every witness, and slowly began to build a picture of how the brothers operated. He understood that they were not simply hiding in the wilderness between attacks, but were being sheltered by a network of sympathizers throughout the region. To find the Russells, he would first have to break that network. Blackwood's tactics were ruthless and effective. He arrested anyone suspected of helping the brothers, holding them for weeks without charge in conditions designed to break their will. He offered massive rewards for information, enough money to transform the life of anyone desperate enough to claim it. He planted spies in every community, every church, every gathering place where mountain people might exchange news. And slowly, the network began to fray. Sympathizers who had once been willing to risk everything for the Russell brothers started to reconsider when faced with the prospect of years in prison or worse. The brothers found their safe havens shrinking, but even as Blackwood closed in, the killings continued. In May, 2 more marshals died within a week of each other, ambushed on remote trails by shooters who vanished into the forest before anyone could respond. In June, Judge Howard Blackwell, who had presided over Benjamin's trial, was pulled from his buggy on a public road and beaten to death in front of witnesses who claimed they couldn't identify his attackers. By midsummer, 13 of the 21 men on the Russell brothers list were dead, and the remaining 8 were living in something approaching constant terror. The break that Blackwood had been waiting for came in August 1903, almost exactly 1 year after Benjamin's arrest. A cousin of the Russell family, a man named Thomas Russell, who had never been close to that branch and who was facing a long prison sentence for an unrelated crime, agreed to provide information in exchange for his freedom. He knew the general area where the brothers had established their base camp and was willing to lead Blackwood there in exchange for money and safe passage out of the state. The marshal agreed without hesitation. The assault on the Russell brothers' camp was carefully planned and executed with overwhelming force. Blackwood assembled a team of 50 hand-picked men, all of them experienced fighters who had proven themselves in previous conflicts. They included former soldiers who had served in the Indian Wars, bounty hunters who had tracked fugitives across multiple states, and local men who knew the terrain and were motivated by the substantial rewards being offered. Each man was armed with a rifle and 2 pistols, and they carried enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged firefight. Blackwood left nothing to chance. They approached the camp before dawn on a moonless night, moving in 3 columns that would converge on the Russell position from different directions. The going was treacherous, with every step threatening to dislodge loose rocks or snap branches that would alert the targets to their approach. But Blackwood's men were professionals, and they reached their positions without detection. As the first grey light of dawn began to illuminate the hollow where the Russells had made their stand, Blackwood raised his hand and gave the signal to advance. The camp itself was a fortified position that the brothers had prepared for exactly this eventuality. They had felled trees to create barriers, dug rifle pits that provided cover from incoming fire, and established overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault costly. When Blackwood called for surrender, the response was immediate gunfire that killed 2 of his men and wounded 3 others. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most intense firefights in the history of American law enforcement. What followed was a 3-hour battle that would become legendary in the annals of Appalachian history. The Russell brothers fought with the desperation of men who knew they were going to die. Elijah, the oldest, took a position at the front of the camp and held off the main assault almost single-handedly, his massive frame absorbing punishment that would have killed a lesser man. He fired and reloaded with mechanical precision, his booming voice calling out encouragement to his brothers, even as bullets tore through the air around him. When his rifle was finally shot from his hands, he drew a pistol and continued fighting until a bullet found his heart and he fell at last. Jacob died protecting his wounded brother Isaac, standing over his fallen sibling with an empty rifle until he was cut down by a volley of shots. Even in death, his body shielded Isaac from additional wounds, a final act of sacrifice that embodied everything the Russell brothers represented. Samuel and Daniel attempted to escape through a narrow ravine that offered the only possible route out of the encirclement, but Blackwood had anticipated this move and positioned men to cover the exit. They were caught in a crossfire that killed them both within seconds of each other, their bodies falling together as they had lived together their entire lives. Only Joseph managed to break through the lines. He had been positioned on the far side of the camp when the attack began, and he used the confusion of the battle to slip through a gap in the encirclement that opened when several of Blackwood's men moved to reinforce the main assault. He vanished into the wilderness with nothing but a rifle, a pistol, and the clothes on his back, leaving behind everything except his determination to complete the vendetta his brothers had started. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, Blackwood walked through the camp counting bodies. He found 5 Russell brothers dead and Isaac critically wounded, unlikely to survive the day. He found enough weapons and ammunition to equip a small army, evidence of the planning that had gone into the brothers' campaign, and he found a list, written in a careful hand, containing the names of everyone who had been involved in Benjamin's death. 13 names had been crossed out, 8 remained. The vendetta was unfinished, and 1 brother was still at large. Isaac Russell died of his wounds that evening, without ever regaining consciousness. His body and those of his brothers were transported to Welch, where they were displayed in the public square as a warning to others who might consider challenging the authority of the law. But the display did not have its intended effect. Instead of inspiring fear and obedience, it provoked outrage among the mountain people who saw in the Russell brothers not criminals, but heroes who had fought against injustice. The 6 coffins became a shrine, with people sneaking flowers and notes of tribute, despite the guards posted to prevent such demonstrations. And somewhere in the wilderness, Joseph Russell was still alive and still determined to complete his brother's oath. You see, Joseph Russell was the second youngest of the brothers, and in many ways the most formidable. He had been just 22 years old when Benjamin was hanged, old enough to understand fully what was happening, and young enough to channel his grief into something cold and purposeful. He lacked Elijah's raw strength and Jacob's tactical mind, but he had something perhaps more dangerous, an absolute commitment to his purpose that nothing could shake. His brothers were dead, his family destroyed, and he had nothing left to live for except the completion of their shared oath. 8 men still remained on the list, and Joseph intended to kill every one of them. For 3 months after the destruction of the camp, there was no sign of Joseph Russell. Marshal Blackwood assumed he had fled the state, or perhaps died of wounds sustained in the battle. The 8 surviving targets began to relax slightly, though they still maintained precautions. And then, on a rainy November night, William Pennington himself was found dead in his study, shot through the head at close range. A note pinned to his body read, "Justice for Benjamin Russell, 14 of 21. I am coming for all of you." The killing of William Pennington transformed Joseph Russell from a wanted fugitive into something approaching a folk hero. That's right. Pennington had been despised by virtually everyone in the region, except those who depended on his money, and his death was celebrated in every hollow and mining camp in McDowell County. People who would never have sheltered the Russell brothers before now actively sought to aid Joseph, seeing in his vendetta a chance to strike back against the forces that had oppressed them for so long. Blackwood found his informant network collapsing as fear of reprisal from Joseph Russell proved stronger than fear of the marshal. The remaining 7 targets retreated to Charleston, the state capital, believing that distance and the protection of state authorities would keep them safe. They moved into a single fortified building, a former hotel that had been converted into an apartment complex for wealthy residents, and surrounded themselves with armed guards who patrolled the perimeter around the clock. They installed heavy locks on every door, barred the windows on the lower floors, and established a system of passwords and signals that would alert them to any unauthorized entry. They had transformed their refuge into a fortress. The building they chose was a 3-story brick structure on a respectable street in the capital's commercial district. It had been built during the boom years of the 1880s, with thick walls that would stop most bullets and a layout that limited the approaches any attacker could use. The 7 survivors occupied apartments on the upper 2 floors, reasoning that height would give them additional protection and time to respond if the building was breached. Guards were posted at every entrance, and additional men patrolled the surrounding streets, watching for any sign of the last Russell brother. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and nothing happened. The survivors began to relax slightly, telling themselves that perhaps Joseph had given up, or that he was simply unable to reach them in the heart of the state's power. They resumed some of their normal activities, though always with an armed escort, and always with an eye toward the nearest exit. Some even began to believe that the nightmare was over, that they would survive to tell their grandchildren about the time they had been hunted by the mountain phantoms and lived to tell the tale. They were wrong. Joseph Russell spent those months not hiding but preparing. He traveled across the state under assumed names, gathering information about his target's new location and the defenses they had erected. He studied the building where they lived, noting the guard schedules, the delivery times, the patterns of life that would allow him to find a weakness. He cultivated contacts in Charleston, servants and workers who had no love for the men who had killed his brother and his other siblings, and when he was ready, he struck with a precision that would become the stuff of legend. The assault on the Charleston fortress came on the night of February 14, 1904, a date Joseph had chosen deliberately. He had somehow obtained blueprints of the building and identified a coal chute that provided access to the basement, a route that the guards had never considered because it seemed too small for a man to navigate. Joseph was not a large man, and he squeezed through that chute in the darkness, emerging in a storage room just after midnight. He moved through the building like a ghost, dispatching guards silently with a knife he had learned to use with deadly precision during his months of hiding. By dawn, all 7 remaining targets were dead, killed in their beds or in the hallways as they fled for their lives. Joseph Russell had completed his brother's oath in a single night of violence that would shock the entire state. The notes he left behind were more elaborate than before, containing not just the running tally, but detailed explanations of each victim's role in Benjamin's death. He wanted the world to know that this was not random violence, but targeted justice, punishment for specific crimes that the legal system had refused to address. The final note, left on the body of Judge Blackwell's law clerk, read, "Justice for Benjamin Russell, 21 of 21. My brothers are avenged. May God have mercy on all our souls. But Joseph Russell's vendetta was not quite complete. He had one more task to accomplish before he could rest. You see, the morning after the Charleston massacre, Joseph Russell walked calmly into a telegraph office and sent messages to every major newspaper in the state. These messages contained a detailed account of everything that had happened since Benjamin's arrest, from the false charges and corrupt trial to the public execution and the campaign of vengeance that followed. He named names and provided evidence that had been gathered by his brothers during their months of hunting. He explained the reasons for each killing and challenged anyone to argue that his targets had not deserved their fates. And then he announced that he would surrender himself to the authorities at noon that very day. The surrender of Joseph Russell drew a crowd of over 5,000 people to the Charleston Courthouse Square, a gathering that included newspaper reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago. People who had heard of the Russell brothers' vendetta wanted to see with their own eyes the man who had killed 21 men in revenge for his brother's death. Some came hoping to see a monster, some came hoping to see a hero, and some came simply to witness a moment of history that they knew would never be repeated. Joseph Russell walked into that square at precisely noon, unarmed and alone, his hands raised above his head. He was smaller than most people had imagined, thin from months of living in the wilderness, his face bearing the marks of hardship and grief, but his eyes were calm and clear, showing no fear of what was about to happen to him. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had kept the oath sworn on that mountainside while his brother's body jerked at the end of a rope. Whatever came next, he could face it knowing that he had done his duty. The trial of Joseph Russell was the most sensational legal proceeding West Virginia had ever witnessed. Newspapers across the country sent reporters to cover every detail, and the courtroom was packed each day with spectators who had traveled from across the state and beyond. Some came to see a monster, the man who had participated in killing 21 people in cold blood. Others came to see a hero, a man who had exposed corruption and delivered justice that the legal system had been unwilling to provide. The reality, as always, was more complicated than either simple narrative could capture. The prosecution was led by the state's Attorney General himself, a man named William Morrison, who had political ambitions that depended on securing a conviction and the maximum penalty. He presented his case methodically over 3 weeks, calling witnesses who had survived the attacks, introducing the notes that had been left at each crime scene, and building a picture of calculated violence that he argued could only be answered with death. He spoke of the victims not as corrupt officials who had participated in an unjust execution, but as husbands and fathers, men who had served their state and paid the ultimate price for that service. The defense team, funded by contributions from mountain communities throughout Appalachia, pursued a very different strategy. They called witnesses who testified to the corruption that had characterized Benjamin's arrest and trial, including a former deputy who had been present when the charges were fabricated and who had fled the state rather than participate further. They introduced evidence of financial connections between the prosecutors and William Pennington, showing that the men who had condemned Benjamin to death had been paid to do so. They painted a picture of a system so thoroughly corrupt that no citizen could expect justice within it. The jury deliberated for 3 days, the longest deliberation in state history to that point. When they finally returned their verdict, the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. Guilty, they announced, on all 21 counts of murder, but they also recommended mercy, asking the judge to impose a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death. The judge, mindful of the public sentiment that had made this case a national cause, agreed. Joseph Russell would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he would not hang as his brother had hanged. Joseph Russell entered the state penitentiary in Moundsville in October 1904, 26 years old, and facing a sentence that would keep him behind walls until he died. The prison was a massive Gothic structure that had been built in the 1870s, designed to intimidate and isolate its inmates from the outside world. Its stone walls were 4 feet thick in places, its cell blocks arranged in tiers that allowed guards to monitor hundreds of prisoners at once, its workshops and exercise yards enclosed by barriers that seemed insurmountable. Joseph was assigned to a cell on the 3rd tier of the main cell block, a space barely large enough to contain a cot, a small table, and a chamber pot. He would spend 23 hours of each day in this space for the first 5 years of his sentence, allowed out only for meals and a single hour of exercise in the prison yard. The isolation might have broken a lesser man, but Joseph had spent months alone in the wilderness after his brothers' deaths, and he had learned to find peace in solitude. He proved to be a model prisoner from the very first day, quiet and cooperative, never challenging the guards or causing trouble with other inmates. He spent his days reading books that reminded him of the brother he had lost, the same books that Benjamin had loved, the same volumes that had opened their eyes to a world beyond the mountains. He developed a particular interest in law and philosophy, reading everything the prison library had to offer on these subjects, perhaps trying to understand the systems that had failed his family so completely. He received thousands of letters over the years, some condemning him as a murderer and some praising him as a hero. Some came from families of his victims, expressing rage and grief that had not diminished with time. Others came from strangers who had read about his case and felt moved to offer support. He answered none of them, preferring to keep his thoughts private. The vendetta was over, his brothers were avenged, and nothing else seemed to matter anymore. He was a man who had completed his purpose and was now simply waiting for time to claim what remained of his life. The decades passed slowly behind those stone walls. Joseph watched from his cell window as the world outside changed in ways that would have been unimaginable when he was a young man. The Great War came and went. Automobiles replaced horses on the roads. Electricity reached even the most remote mountain communities. The coal companies that had dominated the region during his youth declined in power as new energy sources emerged. Everything changed, and Joseph Russell remained the same, an aging man in a small cell, living with memories that no one else could share. The story of the Russell brothers might have ended there, behind the stone walls of Moundsville, if not for what happened 30 years later. In 1934, as part of a review of old cases prompted by the reform administration of a new governor, Joseph Russell's file was reopened. Investigators discovered evidence that had been suppressed during Benjamin's original trial. Evidence that proved conclusively that the charges against him had been fabricated by William Pennington, and that every official involved in the case had known the boy was innocent. The new governor, moved by this revelation and by Joseph's exemplary prison record, granted him a full pardon. Joseph Russell walked out of Moundsville Penitentiary on September 1, 1934, exactly 32 years after his brother Benjamin had been hanged in the public square of Welch. He was 54 years old, his hair white, his body weakened by decades of confinement, but he walked out of those gates under his own power, his head held high as it had been on the day he surrendered. A small crowd had gathered to witness his release, some supporters who had campaigned for his pardon, and some curious onlookers who wanted to see the last of the Russell brothers with their own eyes. The world that Joseph emerged into bore little resemblance to the one he had left behind 30 years earlier. The coal camps that had once dominated McDowell County were mostly abandoned now, their populations dispersed to cities in the north, where industrial jobs offered better prospects. The company towns had fallen into decay, their stores and houses empty, their streets overgrown with weeds. The feudal power that William Pennington and his kind had exercised was broken, replaced by labor unions and government regulations that the old coal barons would never have tolerated. The mountains themselves remained, but the human landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Joseph returned to McDowell County, to the hollow where he had been born, and found only ruins where the family homestead had once stood. The cabin had collapsed during his imprisonment, its logs rotting and settling into the earth that had supported them for so long. The barn was gone entirely, torn down for its lumber by someone who had needed building materials. Only the stone foundation remained, marking the spot where 7 brothers had grown up together, where they had learned to hunt and fight and love each other with a ferocity that would ultimately lead to their destruction. He built a small cabin on the old foundation, working alone through the autumn of 1934 and into the winter. His hands had lost some of their skill during his years of imprisonment, but the knowledge was still there, the understanding of how logs fit together and how structures could be made to stand against the mountain weather. By spring he had a shelter that was crude but serviceable, a place where he could live out whatever years remained to him in the land where he belonged. He married a widow named Martha Coleman in 1936, a woman who had been a girl when the vendetta began and who had grown up hearing stories about the Russell brothers and their terrible justice. She had written to Joseph during his imprisonment, one of the thousands who had reached out to him, and she had continued writing over the decades, receiving no response but never giving up hope that someday he would read her words. When he finally came home, she was waiting for him, and they built a life together that neither had ever expected to have. Joseph lived quietly for another 12 years until his death in 1946, never speaking publicly about what he and his brothers had done, never granting interviews to the reporters and historians who sought him out. He worked a small farm, attended church on Sundays, and was known to his neighbors as a gentleman who never raised his voice and never spoke ill of anyone. Only Martha knew the full story of his past, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him, the grief that never fully healed. She kept his secrets until her own death in 1958, and some of them she took to her grave. The Russell brothers' vendetta passed into legend almost as soon as it was over, becoming one of those stories that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about them, books were published, and their tale became a symbol of resistance against injustice that resonated far beyond the borders of West Virginia. The hollow where they grew up became a pilgrimage site for those who saw in their story something that spoke to their own experiences of loss and rage and the desperate measures that grief can inspire. Musicians traveled there to absorb the atmosphere of the place, hoping that proximity to history would somehow inform their art. Writers came to interview the old people who still remembered the events, gathering details that would otherwise be lost to time. The songs that were written about the Russell brothers varied widely in their approach and their message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, providing a musical version of history that could be passed from generation to generation. Others were more interpretive, focusing on the emotional content of the story rather than its factual details. The most famous of these songs, called simply The Russell Boys, was written in 1923 by a Kentucky songwriter named James Edward Thompson, and it has been recorded by dozens of artists over the years. Its haunting melody and simple lyrics captured something essential about the tragedy that more elaborate accounts often missed. The academic interest in the Russell brothers began in the 1950s when historians started examining the conflicts between rural communities and industrial capitalism during the Gilded Age and Progressive era. The vendetta became a case study in how systemic injustice could provoke individual violence, and it was analyzed from perspectives ranging from Marxist class analysis to psychological studies of grief and revenge. Each generation of scholars brought new frameworks and new questions to the material, finding in it reflections of whatever concerns dominated their own time. The Russell brothers proved to be infinitely adaptable symbols, available for appropriation by almost any cause. The graves of the Russell brothers lie together on a hillside overlooking the hollow where they were born. 6 of them died in the battle at their camp or from wounds sustained there. Joseph alone lies apart from his siblings, buried next to his wife in the small cemetery near the town where he spent his final years. But local people say that on September 1st of each year, the anniversary of Benjamin's execution, you can hear voices on the wind in that hollow, 7 brothers reunited in death as they were united in life. Whether this is true or merely the kind of story that attaches to places where terrible things have happened, it adds another layer to the legend. And today, that hollow in McDowell County remains a destination for those who remember, for those who understand what happened there and what it meant. The cabin where the Russell boys grew up is long gone, rotted away, and reclaimed by the forest. But the trees still stand, and the creek still flows, and the mountains still keep their ancient watch over the valley, where 7 brothers learned to love each other with a ferocity that would ultimately destroy them and transform them into something immortal. The story of the Russell brothers endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. You see, what the Russell brothers did cannot be justified by any conventional moral framework, cannot be excused or explained away, or fitted neatly into categories of right and wrong. They killed 21 men, some of whom bore heavy responsibility for Benjamin's death. and some of whom were guilty only of being present at the wrong moment. They terrorized an entire region for over a year, creating widows and orphans who suffered just as they had suffered. The violence they committed was disproportionate by any reasonable measure, fueled by grief that consumed all perspective and all restraint. These facts cannot be dismissed or diminished by any sympathy for their circumstances, and yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of madness and murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that violence is wrong. They were brothers who watched their youngest sibling murdered by a corrupt system that offered no justice and no accountability, men pushed beyond every limit of human endurance, into a place where violence seemed like the only remaining language. The system that should have protected Benjamin instead killed him on false charges, and the system that should have punished those responsible instead celebrated them. What response could a society expect from men so completely failed by every institution designed to provide protection and recourse? Their story challenges us to consider what we ourselves might do in similar circumstances, what any family might do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate recourse. It offers no comfortable conclusions, no clean moral lessons, only the raw fact of human capacity for both cruelty and consequence. The officials who killed Benjamin Russell never imagined that their action would result in 21 deaths and the destruction of an entire family. The brothers never imagined that their lives would end this way when they rode to town that summer morning to save their sibling. All of them were swept up in forces larger than themselves, in historical patterns and institutional failures that no individual could control. The coal companies that had provoked the Russell brothers' vendetta continued their operations for decades, extracting wealth from the mountains, while leaving poverty and devastation in their wake. The same forces that had driven a wedge between mountain families and outside authorities continued to operate. The same dynamics that had created the Russell tragedy continued to shape the lives of subsequent generations. The specific actors changed, but the fundamental tensions remained, and the story of what happened in 1902 served as a reminder that pushed hard enough, ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things. History remembers the Russell brothers in many different ways, depending on who tells their story and why. To some, they remain cold-blooded killers who murdered 21 men, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing emotion to override law and civilization. To others, they are heroes who struck back against injustice when no other recourse remained, proof that even the most powerful authorities could not act with impunity forever. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between these extremes, in the complicated territory where grief and violence and love and desperation intersect and transform ordinary humans into extraordinary actors. The mountains of McDowell County remain today, much as they were in 1902, ancient and patient and indifferent to the human dramas that play out in their hollows and on their ridges. The creeks still flow cold and clear, the trees still change color each autumn. The old mining towns still struggle with poverty that seems as permanent as the stone itself. Federal and state authorities still occasionally pass through, but they do so with a caution born of historical memory, aware that the people they encounter carry generations of grievance and generations of capacity for resistance. The balance of power has shifted since the Russell brothers' time, but the underlying tensions have not disappeared. The descendants of the Russell family still live in those West Virginia hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and burden. Some have embraced the family legacy, speaking at memorial events and cooperating with researchers who want to understand what happened in 1902. Others have tried to distance themselves, changing their names or moving to places where no one has heard of the Russell brothers or the 21 men who died in their vendetta. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by a story they can neither escape nor fully understand. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Russell brothers stood? To see the hills they loved and the hollow where they were born? Would you walk the paths they walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hollows since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow itself is difficult to access. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That's standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs or even the most careful historical accounts. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Russell brothers close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in McDowell County in 1902, as long as brothers love each other with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as injustice provokes responses that cannot be predicted or controlled. They are gone now, dust mingling in the earth of the hollow where they were born, but what they did, and what was done to them, echoes still through time, and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Russell brothers, who hunted and killed 21 men in vengeance for the public hanging of their youngest brother Benjamin. A story of love and loss, of justice and vengeance, of the limits of human endurance and what happens when those limits are exceeded. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.